lovelies. We might have a few latecomers, so we'll just squeeze them in when they get here. Hi. Welcome to Lighthouse on a sunny Sunday afternoon. My name is Myri. I run the bookshop here, and it was such a treat to be approached to host this event. And we couldn't quite find the right time, and they were like, early Sunday. We will add an event on a night. We never do events because we really want to have this discussion, so thank you very much for joining us. I'm just going to give some very brief introductions to tonight's speakers, and then they're going to have a chat, and then you guys have a chance to ask questions. Anyone who's watching online, you can also pop your questions in the chat, and we will add them in here, and then there will be a signing afterwards, and you can ask any questions you didn't get around to or were too shy to ask. But don't be shy, it's a very safe space. So with us tonight, we have Quill Kukla, who is Professor of Philosophy and Disability Studies at Georgetown University. Their research interests include ethics with a focus on bioethics, sexual ethics, health communication ethics, and science ethics. We have an incredibly ethical person in the room. An interest in ethics. Their fourth book, Sex Beyond Yes, Pleasure and Agency for Everyone, was published by Norton in September 2025, and this is the book we're launching tonight. With us to host this discussion is Miriam Müller, who is a lecturer in feminist legal and political theory at Glasgow University. Her research lies at the intersection of feminist, social, and political philosophy. She focuses on feminist injustice and social change, and she is the author of Global Sweatshops, a feminist theory of exploitation and resistance. Will you join me in welcoming tonight's speakers? Thank you.
Wonderful. So wonderful to see everyone here, and such a joy and pleasure to be discussing Quill's wonderful book tonight. It's a particular pleasure because I've just learned a lot from Quill over the years, and their work has been really influential on my thinking about how we relate to one another and how we kind of create relationships that are nourishing and enabling and agential, and not just in sex. And I think part of what makes their work so influential on my thinking, and also I think what makes this book such an insightful and just wonderful read is just their really precise look at, precise and careful, also caring look at the kind of way in which social practices work and the kind of real fabric of how our relationships work. And I think that really comes out in this book. And so I just, by way of introduction, I think there will be so much more could say about this book, and I'm sure we'll get to a lot of it in the discussion as well. Just want to highlight two things that kind of particularly set out to me in reading this book. And one is this aspect of moving us beyond kind of consent and moving us and giving us a much richer and broader vocabulary to think about what ethically good sex is. So it doesn't stop just at the yes, we kind of start figuring out together what kind of sex we want to have with one another. And I think one of the aspects that really resonated with me was this discussion around ambivalence. So this question of, because it seems to me, and I'm sure, or hope, I guess many of you share that experience, that when I walk through life, so many of the things and decisions I take are really ambivalent, and even once I've decided to do things, I might still not be sure if and how I want to do them, and it just is a bit odd to think that that shouldn't be the case in sex, and that once we do sex, we know exactly what we want and when we want it, and once we've decided, this is it. And so I think you're really giving us the vocabulary to deal with that ambivalence, and I love that about the book. And the second thing is that it just also moves us beyond just merely kind of thinking about what is wrong with all sorts of sex, to think about what kind of sex we want. And again, I think most of us who are interested in sex don't walk through life just fending off bad sex, but we're actually kind of thinking about what kind of sex we want to have, what kind of fulfilling sex, agential sex, etc. And I think again here, kind of this idea of negotiating, or sex as a negotiation, and that kind of a joint negotiation is really wonderful. So I want to just start by asking you, why did you write this book, and what are you hoping it will do?
Thank you. This is good volume-wise? Okay, yeah, thanks for that introduction, and I'm just so happy that Miriam agreed to do this event. I think it's our philosophical and social relationship has been mutually fulfilling, I hope, so I'm really pleased she's here to do it. In answering the question of why I wrote the book, I actually love the way you set it up for me by talking about how we don't walk through the world just fending off bad sex. so there were a few things that I was trying to accomplish. But first and foremost, as I was doing a lot of reading about sex, both academic and philosophical reading, and also just sort of reading of stuff out there in the culture, what I was finding is that regardless of political orientation, and including feminist stuff that was being written on sex, there seemed to be almost always a huge focus on how sex can go wrong and how sex can be harmful. And of course it can, and this is important work. A lot of this work talks about how, sex is happening within the context of patriarchy and misogyny, and that messes it up, and it'll often start with a litany of the terrible things that men do to women and so forth. And I found very little out there about good sex, and I really wanted to write a book that was not just about how to block bad sex, fend it off, but to have good, pleasurable sex. Good in the sense of ethical, but also good just in the sense of enjoyable and worthwhile for us. So for my first goal was to write a book about good sex. Second goal really comes from the title, Sex Beyond Yes, which is, I thought that I wanted to talk about the fact that saying yes to sex isn't enough to make it good. And furthermore, literally beyond that, what can we do to have good quality thoughts and conversations about what happens after yes, right? Yes is at most a bare minimum. But then let's talk about what happens next, right? So literally sex beyond yes. What happens during sex, what happens after sex, what happens around sex, all of that stuff. Third thing is, I also found that as I was doing reading, almost all of the literature out there, even when it was progressive work, that made sure to acknowledge that queer sex exists and that kinky sex exists, and that not everybody is cis and so forth, still let the traditional heterosexual encounter kind of define the imaginative center, which is often why it was so focused on critique and so on. But that sex still seemed to be at the center, and then there would be these sort of notes that, oh, of course, by the way, there's other kinds of sex at best, right? And so this is about the second half of my title, The Pleasure for Everyone, Pleasure and Agency for Everyone. I really wanted to write a book that genuinely did not center traditional heterosexual sex. It's in there, but I wanted to center sex for every kind of body and every kind of gender identity and every kind of sexual orientation. I wanted to center, kinky people, disabled people, old people, all kinds of people who don't usually get discussed in this literature, and center them really in two senses. One is I wanted to write a book that was for everybody. But also, I knew from my own life that there is a lot of wisdom out there about sex and sexual autonomy in kinky communities and queer communities and poly communities, sex worker communities, and academics and social commentators don't yet generally tap that wisdom, So I wanted to write a book that was for everybody, but also really drew on that wisdom and brought it into the book. I'm trained as a philosopher. I'm a philosophy professor. I've written a lot of philosophy articles and philosophy books, and when I'm writing academic philosophy, I like to think of myself as a pretty clear, evocative writer, but this book is supposed to be different. It's not supposed to be for philosophers, and I didn't want to write another abstract book, which was a set of arguments. I'm also trained as a geographer and an ethnographer, and I wanted to bring in life experience and narrative and the messiness of the actual world and write something less abstract. So that's a whole bunch of reasons why I wrote it.
Right, do you want to start with reading?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to do, probably, if things go according to plan, I'm going to do 2 little readings. But I'm going to start with the first one, which starts right at the beginning of the book. So this is the beginning of chapter 1, which is called Beyond Consent. A young woman who thinks of herself as a feminist fantasizes about her new boyfriend tying her up. The idea of being helpless and at his mercy makes her feel sexy. One day, as they're messing around, he takes out ropes and slowly begins to tie her with them. She's pretty sure he would stop if she asked him to or struggled, but she doesn't. He proceeds. She finds the whole thing a huge turn-on, but also worries that her desire for submission and his desire for domination might both be sexist. She wonders why she wants this kind of play and why he does. An 87-year-old man with moderate dementia often forgets that he lives in a long-term care facility. Sometimes he recognizes his husband who comes to visit, and sometimes he doesn't. But when he has sex with his husband, he responds with obvious pleasure and affection, and he often asks for his husband when he's alone. Today, his husband asks him if he's feeling sexy, and he says yes, and they make love. After a lifetime of feeling unattractive and an evening of moderate drinking, a middle-aged man who has always been a bit of a loner is approached by a younger woman in a bar. She asks him if he wants to fuck her in the alley. He feels awkward and not really turned on, but he worries that turning her down would be ungrateful and unmanly. He also wonders if he will ever get another chance for this kind of encounter, so he goes with her. Are these stories of good sex, ethical sex, consensual sex? Do the people in these stories have sexual agency? That is, are their actions in these situations self-determining, self-expressive, and not hijacked by anyone else's goals or desires or by manipulative social pressures? I expect that each of these stories will make readers uneasy. They're not ethically clean, and they might end up involving harm. At the same time, each of them has the potential to turn out to be a story about sexual joy and fulfillment. What more would we want to know about these people, their communication with one another, and their situations, to decide if these are stories about sex going well or poorly? How could each of these stories above turn out to affirm or undercut sexual agency, depending on the details? So many of our conversations about sexual ethics and sexual agency focus on consent. But notice that in these scenarios, whether everyone consented is not really what we want to know. It's already clear that in the first scenario, there was no moment of explicit verbal consent, but also that the woman does not try to stop her boyfriend from proceeding or show any distress. In the second scenario, knowing that the man with dementia said the word yes doesn't help much with our unease, which is about sense of self, competence, and vulnerability. In the third scenario, the man certainly seems to be acting under his own free will, but our discomfort remains. It's always necessary that everyone in a sexual encounter is participating freely and voluntarily. And of course, if someone makes clear that they don't want to participate in a sexual activity, then it's never okay to proceed. But the narrow question, did they say yes to sex, is not the most pressing one we need answered before we can judge whether the complex sexual encounters in these scenarios went well. Here are some different questions you might have about the people in the opening stories. How long have the young woman and her boyfriend been together? And how good is he at reading and responding to any signs she might give that she's uncomfortable or wants to stop? Did he already know that she fantasized about bondage? Do they have a sexist dynamic outside of the bedroom? Can they talk to one another about their desires and how these might play into gender stereotypes? Could she easily and safely leave if she wanted to? Does she have a community with which she can talk about her feminist qualms with bondage and her attraction to it? Or would she be slut-shamed or called out as a bad feminist for bringing the topic up? As for the older man with dementia and his husband, how good is the visiting husband at understanding and respecting when his partner is aware of his surroundings and able to make decisions and when he isn't? Does this long-term care facility support its residents' sexual desires and agency? Or does the couple have to sneak sex on the sly? Is there a support team who can give medical advice about his state of mind and who will provide help if anything goes wrong? And finally, when it comes to the man in the alley, does he find the encounter thrilling and affirming or depressing? How drunk is he? Does the woman treat their encounter as a fun adventure, or does she ultimately humiliate him? He chooses to have sex even though he feels ambivalent, but does he also feel like he could choose otherwise? If she harmed him, would he be too embarrassed to get help? Does he treat her well? Whether these are stories of good or bad sex, ethical or exploitative sex, free or unfree sex, depends on all these details and more. This is a book about good sex. I want to explore how we can expand and protect our own and one another's sexual agency and pleasure, and enjoy wanted, satisfying, ethically sound sex. Although some people are asexual, that is, they do not experience sexual attraction or desire, sex is a basic and important source of pleasure, fulfillment, and self-expression for most people. A society that supports human flourishing will make opportunities for people to access sexual pleasure and to exercise sexual agency in safe and ethical ways. At the same time, sex is an arena in which people are vulnerable and especially open to exploitation, injury, coercion, and other kinds of harm. Protecting ourselves against bad sex is central to enjoying good sex, and an ethics of promoting sexual pleasure and agency can never be fully separate from an ethics of avoiding sexual violation and harm. So this book will discuss both good and bad sex, sex that goes right and sex that goes wrong. But while I won't avoid or deny the reality and seriousness of bad sex, sexual assault, and rape, I want to focus first and foremost on sexual pleasure, sexual agency, and sex that goes well for everyone. And I'm also going to just read a shorter passage from the beginning of chapter 2. This is the chapter called Sex Talk, which is the one that focuses on sexual negotiation. You and your friend are traveling together in a new city, and you decide to take a long walk to explore. As you go, you say things to one another such as, "Hey, that's a cool looking alley, let's take a detour down it, okay? This street is kind of boring and trafficy, not as good to walk on as we thought it would be. Let's pick another route. Can we stop in this bookstore for a few minutes? Let's find a nice place to stop for a coffee break. And importantly, I'm getting tired and my feet are starting to hurt. Can we jump on the subway and go home soon?" Unless you're especially passive-aggressive and a bad communicator, you don't just hope that your friend will pick up on your subtle body language if you eye that appealing alley or coffee shop longingly, or start performatively limping a bit to indicate that you want to go home. You won't start your walk by saying, "Will you take a walk with me?" and then just assume that if your friend says yes, they're stuck with whatever kind of walk comes next for however long you feel like walking. Instead, you set some loose provisional goals with your walking partner in advance. You agree that you have a few hours free to walk, and that you would like to explore a particular neighborhood and get lunch along the way, although you can always change that plan if something more fun pops up, or if the original plan turns out to be less fun than you expected. It makes sense to tell your friend from the start if there's a gallery or a taco truck that you've really been wanting to make it to, or if you have an injury that means that you need to walk a little more slowly than usual. It would be bizarre to think that such conversations kill the vibe of the walk. It would also be bizarre to spend the walk barking formal requests and permissions at one another and imposing a lot of rules. Are you willing to turn left here? No. No walking after sundown. Okay. Can we keep walking? Yes. This kind of rigid exchange of requests and responses is not how we enjoy a walk together. But this doesn't mean that we should walk in silence. All this talking, setting some goals, making some suggestions as you go, maybe mentioning some constraints, checking in, adjusting, building a rhythm and a route together, making sure both of you are still happy to keep walking, help the walk be a good, interesting joint activity. Likewise, good sex often involves a lot of talk. When we have sex, we want to be able to set some shared expectations, but also explore some surprise alleys and stop for some unplanned treats along the way. There's an idea in broad circulation that a lot of talk leading up to or during sex is burdensome because it's unsexy or breaks the flow. But this idea is rooted in the traditional consent framework. People imagine that chatty sex would consist of constant requests, consents, and refusals. That would indeed be super annoying and unsexy. If you're finding that talking before and during sex kills the mood, you need to practice your sexy talking skills, not just stay quiet and hope for the best. A lot of our communication leading up to and during sex is not verbal, and this is appropriate. We use our bodies and our eyes to invite, to show pleasure and displeasure, to suggest, and more. I'm interested in all the communication that goes on around sex, but talking is an integral part of that, and talking is far from inherently unsexy. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much. There's a lot to pick up on here.
Yes.
I think I'm going to focus on one aspect, but I'm sure we're going to get to some of the other aspects as well. So one of the things I want to just ask about is one, your rejection of the kind of contractual model of sex, and then perhaps also how that understanding relates to agency beyond sexual agency. And so one of the things that comes out so clearly in this reading that you just gave on this walk is just how you envision just sexual agency to be something very different to this idea of, yes, we have sex, and then there's something that you get in return once you've given consent, and then this idea of it's almost a contractual, the good is sex, and it's a contractual kind of exchange thing, and that is something that you reject very clearly, and replaces with this idea of negotiation, ongoing negotiation and conversation. And I find that very, very insightful, and so I'm just wondering though, because I guess even beyond sex, a lot of the relations that we seem to have seem to be often quite contractual. So I'm just thinking about something like, investing in one's friendships, or like even in romantic relationships that don't have sex, like this idea of, you give something so that you get something in return. And you talk a bit about that later in the book as well. And I guess I just would like to hear a bit more about how you think perhaps your critique of this contractual model in sex would relate to a critique of perhaps this kind of how we relate to one another more generally.
Right. Yeah, thank you. So it's an important point of the book that a lot of our sexual imagination tends to be dominated by and this isn't my phrase, it comes from this wonderful essay by Thomas Millar, but what he calls the commodity model of sex, or what I sometimes call the extractive understanding of sex, where sex is kind of a zero-sum game, right? There's somebody has sex and somebody else is trying to get it from them, and so they need to make an agreement or a trade, and one person wins and one person loses. In some of the right-wing literature, this is very explicit. You see young women being told that their sex is like a savings account and they should hold on to it as long as possible so that their investment becomes more valuable, so that they can trade it for a better deal later. Like, this is real explicit, right? But even when it's not that explicit, this kind of idea that, usually men are trying to get sex and women are trying to keep it, and they come to a deal, is very dominant, and I think extremely toxic, and leads to a lot of awful sex. And so, yes, I'm trying to provide an alternative to that. And of course, you're absolutely right that there are commodified and extractive exchanges that happen all over the place, and not just in sexual domain. I don't think that they're always necessarily bad. I think that sometimes in life you need to just reach a deal or make an agreement, right? I don't expect to have a non-contractual relationship with my landlord, say. Maybe there shouldn't be landlords, but whoever it is who's giving me housing, right? I don't expect to have a non-contractual relationship with them. There are little contractual things that happen all the time. I don't even think it's necessarily awful if you have a friend and, under some limited circumstances, you make a kind of a deal with them. You're like, okay, I'll go to your stupid work party that I really don't want to go to because you don't want to go by yourself, but in return, you have to help me move next week or whatever. That kind of thing happens, and it's not necessarily bad. But I think what's important is that we don't fundamentally imagine intimate, caring human relations on that model. That's the first point, right? Those contractual moments should be set against a context of a different, more fundamental model of how we relate to one another. That's one point. And the other point is, I think that those kind of contractual moments are only acceptable if they're against a background of everybody who's involved having enough agency to really be empowered in that exchange, and to be able to say, I don't want to live my life contractually in general, but in this limited sense, I'm freely giving up some of my more interesting forms of agency to enter into this narrower agreement, but that's contained and against the background of having a life where I genuinely have agency and have more meaningful relationships to people, right? I'm trying to not yet talk about some of the stuff that I know we're going to talk about soon, but basically I just feel like the contractual, it's not like all contracts are evil, but they're not the basic form of good human relationship, and they should always be contained moments against the background of something else.
There is this quote, and I forgot by whom, but it goes something like, how much money do I need to give you in order for you to love me as I am? Like,
Right,
does anyone
right.
know who that said? No.
No,
But I think this is like just this highlighting the limits of the contract, right? In
Right.
terms of the intimate relationships, and I think you kind of draw that out so clearly in the book
Right.
as well. And
Yeah, and I'll just add, like, that's basically, so I have a chapter on sex work, and to dramatically simplify, that's basically the conclusion I come to in that chapter also, right? Is that there's nothing inherently wrong in the context of sex work, with having contractual sex, but that contractual sex has to be against the background of agency, right? So sex workers can make a very, as long as they're well supported by their world and genuinely agential and empowered, they can make a very reasonable decision to have this kind of contractual sex, but it has to be contextualized. Yeah.
I think because we want to talk more about the scaffolding, I want to get there.
Yeah.
I
I
hear
wanna
what you're
get there
saying.
too, yeah.
But we wanted to do a reading in between.
Should I
on
do that now? Yeah. Why
Do
don't I
the
do
reading,
that
and
now?
then we
Yeah.
talk about the
I'll do one
scaffolding.
more little reading. The time always goes so fast, I find, but I will try to be. I will hopefully be efficient. Yeah. So I hope also that this reading doesn't need setup; that it explains itself. But only if I started in the right place. Okay. Yeah. So this is from the chapter called "Scaffolding Good Sex." Excuse me. Gene is a 19-year-old man who is attracted to other men. He lives in a strict religious community within which homosexuality is viewed as a sin worthy of exile, in a country where homosexuality is still treated as a serious crime. He's had no sex education and finds his own desires confusing and unclear, but he does not dare discuss them with anyone. He strikes up a friendship with Guy, a local 22-year-old man. Guy has had some experience with gay sex and suggests to Gene that they should try having sex. Gene is attracted to Guy, but he isn't sure what this would involve. Gene is a 19-year-old man who's attracted to other men. He's trans, and he has only recently started living publicly as a man, and only in some contexts. His family and his high school friends don't know he's trans, and he's not ready to come out to them. He lives in a fairly progressive city, and he has several gay friends, but no trans friends. He decides to go by himself to a local queer sex party, presenting as a man. At the party, the hosts offer explicit instructions for how to approach others and how to negotiate consent. But this is a new kind of environment for Gene, and he's very nervous. He's shy about talking to anyone and doesn't know how to navigate revealing his anatomy to a potential partner. After several drinks, he strikes up a conversation with 22-year-old Guy, who he suspects is flirting with him. Gene would like to try to initiate sex with Guy, but he isn't sure how. Gene is a 19-year-old man who's attracted to other men. He has been seeing 22-year-old Guy for several months. Gene grew up around queer people, and both of them live in the same queer collective. The collective gets along great, although a few years ago, one of the members was abusive towards two of the others. After a series of house meetings, the abuser was asked to leave, and the members of the collective worked to make sure that the victims had the support they needed to feel safe staying. Gene and Guy enjoy playing a game where they draw cards to see which sexy things they will do that night, although either of them can veto any card that comes up. Tonight they've agreed that they're both in the mood for playing with new rope that they bought together. In each of these scenarios, Gene wants to have sex with Guy, and there's no reason to think that anyone is going to be pressured into anything non-consensual. But Gene's sexual agency is quite different in each case. In the first scenario, Gene's sexual agency is minimal. He's scared and ashamed, and he has no community support. He doesn't know how to articulate his desires. If anything goes wrong in a sexual encounter with Guy, the consequences could be catastrophic for him. For all these reasons, Gene's choices are limited, and he can't really safely negotiate the choices that he does have. He also doesn't fully understand what he wants or what he can or can't do. His ability to make informed, safe, self-expressive decisions is severely compromised. In the second scenario, Gene has some support for his agency, but his agency is still compromised in some ways. He's in a safer environment, and he's been given some helpful building blocks for figuring out and expressing what he wants. but he's inexperienced and he doesn't really have a community in which he can be himself and get support. This undermines his confidence and leaves him vulnerable. In the final scenario, Gene has close to maximal agency. He can figure out what he wants and communicate his desires effectively. He trusts his partner to respect his boundaries. He and his partner have built up good sexual communication over time. He has community support and plenty of role models, and he can be fairly confident that if anything goes wrong, he will remain safe. The differences between these scenarios are not differences in Gene's internal capacity to make autonomous choices, nor in Guy's goodwill, nor even in Gene's desires. Rather, the differences are in the scaffolding that Gene's agency has. That is, in each case, Gene's communal, material, educational, legal, and interpersonal surroundings hold his agency in place poorly or well. How much scaffolding he needs and what kind depends on how fragile his agency is and in what ways. In the first scenario, the scaffolding he has is actively bad. His legal, educational, and community environment block his ability to understand his own needs or desires and put him at risk. In the second scenario, as a newly emerging, semi-closeted young trans man in an intense and alien environment, Gene needs more and different kinds of scaffolding than he would in other circumstances. In the final scenario, he's lucky enough to be in a supportive environment in which he is free to experiment and play, expanding his agency and sexual possibilities. People never have sex as an isolated dyad or triad or whatever. All of us are always embedded in a social ecology that scaffolds some activities, experiences, and choices, and not others. Our sexual agency depends not just on what we and our partners say, but also on a wide range of features of our environment. Scaffolding might take the form of a policy, an educational program, a conversation, a building, or a friend group. The best communicators in the world cannot have strong sexual agency in a country with maximally restrictive and punitive sexual norms or laws, or when trapped in a brightly lit room in an institution, such as a prison or a hospital that offers no privacy. These are extreme examples, but none of us exercises our agency in a vacuum. Actually, I'm gonna just stop there so we have more time. Yeah, I'll stop on that. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. So I think this idea of scaffolding is one of the aspects I love most about the book. And so I have a few questions on that. And so I think this example, these three different scenarios of Gene, I think really bring out kind of what scaffolding can do and what it means. But so I wanted to ask you, because I guess the kind of scaffolding we would need, and you said it just now, but also in the book later on you say it involves legal changes, it involves kind of environment, it eliminates body and sexual shaming, it involves kind of drastically reforming presumably our education and health system and guarantee housing and financial security to people. And I mean that's a world I want to live in, but it just seems like given the kind of the situation that we're in at the moment, and so the drastic, for instance, like austerity measures and the privatization of care and education and all of these institutions that would be so important, as well as the kind of authoritarian kind of drive that, you know, as you're well aware, is like massively kind of curbing our sexual and reproductive freedoms. I'm just wondering kind of to what extent or what kind of scaffolding you think will be possible under capitalism, and perhaps also what should we do in the meantime? So what other practices?
Right.
Your vision.
Yeah, I mean, this is a wonderful and pressing question. And I mean, as I'm sure you can tell from both the reading and from Miriam's question, a big point of the book for me is that sexual agency and pleasure and access to sexual agency and pleasure are actually social justice issues. They're not just interpersonal issues. And it is true that a lot of those social justice tools are currently under assault. I don't think that this is a utopian book, because another really crucial message of the book is that we never have perfect autonomy or perfect agency. And for me, that's not even an ideal or a sad thing. I'm trained also, one of my affiliations is in disability studies, and this book talks a little bit about disability, but uses a lot of tools from disability studies. And one of the lessons that I've learned from disability studies and really internalized is that the ideal of perfect agency is not only one that we'll never reach, but it's ill-suited to the human condition, which is always one of frailty and vulnerability and interdependence and fragility and finitude. And so what I want to do is I wanted to give a vision of how we support the agency of beings who are always going to be imperfect, whose autonomy is never going to be ideal, who are always going to be tangled up in power relations that they can never fully extricate themselves from, right? So all of these kinds of scaffolding that I talk about, legal scaffolding, community scaffolding, etc., material scaffolding is really important to me, like what kind of physical space you're in. To me, those are not things that all have to be in place in order to have agency, right? What we're always doing is compensating with some kinds of scaffolding because of weaknesses in other parts of our scaffolding. And that's how actual scaffolding works too, right? Like that's what scaffolding is for, is to like, you know, you do it how you need it to give something stability where it needs to have that, and it's never perfect. So in one sense, I don't feel catastrophic about the fact that nobody's going to be supported in all these ways, legally, financially, blah, 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 right? What we need to do is make up for the fact that we're unsupported in some ways by supporting in other ways. But in terms of the fact that a lot of this stuff is currently under threat, I think that that really means that this is a moment where local communities and grassroots systems of support become more important forms of scaffolding. Creating safe places for people, creating good education for people, you know, maybe not through the school system, but through other means, creating strong systems of, you know, community support and friend groups that really have worked on being free of shaming and free of other kinds of toxic dynamics. I mean, this is stuff that we can do right now in an imperfect world, and it's not going to make up for the fact that our health system and our legal system and so on are betraying us. But I do think that there's a lot of potential there for us holding each other collectively in agency now.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Maybe specifically on the question of community, because I think that's something I also found really striking in the book. And I guess because you give the example of BDSM communities, where of course the kind of this aspect of community is so very explicit often, and even sometimes contraction in a sense, right? Like maybe not in the bad sense that you think, but like you have this idea of there is an accountability within the community, and that people will hold you to the standards that kind of when you kind of sign up to the community in a sense, or when you enter the community, and that you might even, you know, have to leave the community if you don't, you know. And so I'm just wondering what kind of role community can play in maybe less, like outside of BDSM, or less formalized, in broad sense of the term, like context, like private kind of relationships. So how you handle them?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of a stereotype about BDSM communities that they're super formalized, and sometimes they are, but I think maybe the way you put that to me is overstating a little bit just how formalized these communities are. I mean, sometimes, but not usually. And I also think that I want to push back a little bit against the idea that accountability is the same as contractuality, right? I think that the fact that good BDSM and kink communities, because there are also bad ones, right? But good ones are spaces where people are held accountable for their behavior, and where there is a sort of a collective investment in how well community members are behaving. Isn't really, to me, the same as a contract, but it is a kind of interdependence that we don't always see, right? And so in terms of the meat of your question, which is, you know, sort of how do we move that kind of thought out of BDSM communities and into sort of more looser settings is perhaps the phrase for it, right? I do think that a problem that we have is that a lot of people are extraordinarily sexually isolated, right? Especially people who are in very traditional, vanilla, heterosexual relationships often don't have any place where they can talk about these issues or get support. I try to, when I give these, when I do these events, I try to avoid using philosophical jargon, but there is one phrase here which I think is just a really useful one, so I'm just going to give it to you for what it's worth. So philosophers sometimes talk about hermeneutic resources, and hermeneutic resources are all of the stories, concepts, ideas, images, narratives, media, all of that meaningful stuff floating around in the culture that we use to understand ourselves. And part of the problem is that a lot of people, the only hermeneutic resources they have are very narrow social scripts that they're getting from media and so on. Right? They don't have communities where people are sharing stories and sharing ideas and sharing hermeneutic resources. And I think that that's an absolutely key part of sexual agency, because if you don't have the tools to understand your own experience and you don't have people to go to help you understand what's happening, it's very hard to navigate. So, I mean, I think, like, one thing that we can do is just be proactive about really nurturing friend groups and spaces where these kinds of stories can be shared, and making sure that people, and I talk a lot in the book about shame. I just think shame is such a toxic underminer of agency in so many different ways. It comes up in a lot of different ways in the book, right? But giving people communities where they know that they can go if they're having a question or a problem, where shame is off the table, where they will not be blamed for the kind of sex they like or the kind of relationship they found themselves in, right? I don't know how satisfying of an answer that is, but I think, your two questions go together very well, and especially at this moment in history, we really have to be sort of intentionally and reflectively and proactively building those kinds of groups. Yeah, I hope that's helpful. Yeah.
I think we can now open it up to the audience. So if you have any questions, anything that you want to share.
Yeah, and let me just say before you guys start talking, I have found every event like this I've done that the conversation with the audience has been absolutely fantastic. So I'm begging you not to be shy about talking. Like, please talk, because it always goes so well when people talk. I just want to hear whatever anybody has to say. Yeah.
We have a couple of online questions, so we can get you guys warmed up with that.
Okay, sure.
The first one is from Joy, who says, do you have any tips for creating a safe environment for expanding conversations of sex beyond consent? Conversations with mostly cis straight young men and boys has to work so hard even to have consent be the bar to get over. I worry about being accused of diluting that message or triggering people who have experienced sexual assault.
Diluting, I wish that this were in person, because I want to get a sense of which message we're worried about diluting. Was that, maybe it just went too fast for me. Is the message that we're worried about diluting the message of
I think
getting
it's like
people over the bar of consent?
Yes, exactly. That if we keep being like, it's yes and no that we're talking about, and you have to get a yes, and that's all the message is,
Right,
I think,
right.
then if you expand it beyond that, are you diluting the sort of clarity of the message, maybe?
Right. Okay, yeah, I understand the question
And
now.
Joy
Thank
can
you.
jump in and add anything if I missed it.
Yeah, no, I definitely understand now. I mean, so, look, here's the problem, is very little good sex starts that way, right? It's not just that it's too narrow, it's that it really distorts how good sex starts. It's, it does happen. There are contexts in which, sex becomes very ritualized, and people will go up to each other, like, at a well-organized sex party and be like, can I make out with you? Yes, or whatever. But that kind of, one person makes a request and the other person says either yes or no to it, is not generally the way that good sex starts, and it's also very asymmetric. It puts one person in this very passive position of just what their agency comes down to is either refusing or acquiescing, something that somebody else suggested, and it puts the other person in this asymmetric position of like trying to get a yes out of the person. And I worry that giving that message to, including to young boys, actually, or young men, reinscribes the idea that their job is to get a yes out of women. and that they're the active ones and women are the passive ones, and they're supposed to be asking, and if they're doing it well, then they're going to respect the no and get the yes, but it still is giving them an image of how sex works that is not collaborative, and that is presuming that they're trying to get sex and they're just trying to make sure not to do it without transgressing consent. So I guess I'm happy enough with that message that I don't want to keep it, even if young men need real clarity. What I would say is, I think, and I do talk about this a lot in the book, I think that we have done men, and particularly cis straight men, a huge disservice in our culture by positioning them as fundamentally not intrinsically desirable and always ready for sex, right? So their job is, we spend tons of time in our culture making jokes about how men's bodies are gross and penises are gross and men are predators and so on, right? So boys are brought up to think of themselves as not desirable, but also as supposed to always want sex with women at all times, right? Which makes them think, not surprisingly, that their job is to find a way of bartering it out of them, right? Giving them something in reply or manipulating them into it or doing something to get past the fact that they're supposed to always want sex, but they're not desirable beings. So I feel like what we need to do is change the message from the very beginning. Men aren't allowed, we don't even ask, we don't imagine men as needing to consent to sex, right? We don't even stop to ask, are their limits being transgressed? Are they consenting to what's happening? Is this what they want to do? So I think we need to start at the very beginning and start sex education with the message that sex is not an asymmetrical thing. Sex is a joint collaborative project, and most people want it sometimes. So, our job is to find the people who want to engage in this joint pleasurable activity with us and build something together. So we should never even be getting to the point where we have to remind boys, you have to take no for an answer, because we've already set up sex at that point in a way in which it's never going to be good. And I don't think it's actually that complicated of a message to tell kids and teenagers, sex is something that you guys have to jointly talk about together and figure out what you want. You don't get to just take it. That doesn't seem to me so subtle or diluted that we can't give that message, but it's not the message that we give. Yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just kind of as a follow-up to that, I completely agree with starting the education younger and trying to change things at that level, but I was just wondering if you've got any thoughts around how do we change that now as adults? Because I still sometimes feel that, and obviously I don't have the being able to
right.
back in time and go through it all again.
Yeah, and I mean, and this is why it isn't a utopian book, because unfortunately, I don't think we can just suddenly undo all the scripts that we're swimming in and all the norms that we've been brought up, initiated into, and all the ways in which at a fundamental bodily level we have imbibed these toxic gender norms, right? This is why so many of the other books other than mine are about how bad everything is, because there's some reality to that, right? So the book gives lots of here and there strategies, how do we make things better in very local ways, but it's not going to tell you how to just completely leapfrog ourselves out of patriarchy or destroy patriarchy. But I will say this, I think queer communities have a special responsibility here. I think that queer communities have been in a position of having to reflectively figure out sexual ethics and sexual norms because they find themselves not at one with these scripts and stories that they're being given, right? They don't see themselves, or we don't see ourselves reflected in that. And so we have to kind of do that reflection of figuring out from scratch. And oftentimes, I'm not trying to put queer communities on a pedestal, there's toxic things in queer communities too, but oftentimes queer communities and kink communities have already had to grapple with alternative norms, and we should be tapping into that wisdom, like I said at the very beginning. But also, I think people who have that luck have some social responsibility to try to share that wisdom, to try to improve the world and improve the kinds of communities that are out there and the kinds of resources that are out there. I'm not saying that we can fix everything, but I do think that that's where a lot of the resources really are. You look like you wanted to say something. You're good?
I think I'm good for now.
Okay. Did I let her?
Yeah.
I don't know what you want to do about the back and forth.
Yeah, no, I will.
You just yell at me if
They
you want
can
me to.
follow. You go
Yeah,
for it.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank
Yes.
you so much for tonight and increasing our public discourse on sex. It's so needed.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask you about the choice of focusing on sexual agency as
Mhm.
a word, and I guess sometimes I feel that in kind of neoliberal life, there's so much focus on choice and
Yeah.
freedom as being the form of liberation, and
Right.
I see that as being something really important to sex as well. But something I've seen in feminist and queer communities, unfortunately, I feel like in the last, I don't know, in my anecdotal experience, is like a real lack of intimacy,
Yeah.
and also issues with agency around substance use, alcohol, drugs. And so I'm just curious, like, what might be the harms of focusing on sexual agency as a form of liberation, or how did
Yeah.
thinking about that come into your work?
Yeah. No, that's a wonderful question, and it also gives me a nice platform to introduce a couple more of the ideas that I really care about here. So I actually have a big section on drunk and high sex, and I do talk a lot about intimacy. I think I'm going to answer the question backwards in a way. So I think that often, though not always, intimacy is one of the important scaffolds of agency. I don't see them as opposed, right? I'm not against casual hookups and casual encounters, so I'm not saying that there has to be intimacy with every sexual encounter. But oftentimes, our ability to know one another intimately and to build up, not just good communication, but like really deep, good understanding of one another's ways of expressing pleasure and displeasure, their limits, their needs, and so forth, can be what gives one another agency. So I talk in the book about like holding one another in agency as something that we do together in an intimate relationship. There's another beautiful idea from disability studies called access intimacy. The idea is its home is talking about disabled people, but I think it applies much more broadly, right? The idea is if two disabled people know each other really well, they come to understand one another's access needs at like a basic embodied level. So they don't always have to be asking each other what they need, right? You could get to the point where you're like, my friend or my partner, this is going to be too sensorily stimulating for them. We're just not going to go there, right? Or I should take their hand now because this step is going to be difficult for them. That kind of stuff starts to become automatic, and you develop this just sort of reciprocal sense of one another's needs. And I think it has application way past disability studies, right? In the context of sexual relationships also, if they are more long-term, we develop that kind of access intimacy, and that's part of what gives each other agency, right? The fact that the friend's hand is there ready to help the person with the step is what gives them the agency to go wherever that step is taking them. But the other thing that I want to say that's really important, just two more quick things. One is, I'm really into agency, it's true. I'm really agency oriented. I'm kind of obsessed with this in a lot of different domains. I'm thinking that my next book might be on parenting and what it would actually look like to parent for agency. But I do acknowledge, and I say it in the book too, agency is not the only value. There are other values, and we can sometimes make very reasonable choices to actually give up some of our agency for some other good. So it's not the only game in town. And the last thing I want to say, because this is important, is that I draw a distinction. There's a reason why I focus on the word agency. I draw an important distinction in the book between autonomy, which is like the ability to make free choices, versus agency, which is not, it's not that it has nothing to do with autonomy, but for me, agency is not so much about free choice making, it's about living a self-determining, self-expressive life where you are the driver of your own narrative, And so an example that I give is, if you're listening to music that you really love, and you are, bopping around dancing to the music, you might not have even made an autonomous choice to do that. You might not even be aware that you're doing it. And yet you're really expressing your agency in that moment, right? Your body is is expressing its love of this music. So agency and autonomy are not exactly the same. And some amount of autonomy is necessary, of course, but what I really care about is that richer notion, which isn't just about making free choices, right? It's about living in a way where you are, where you can take pleasure in who you are expressing yourself as being, and you are determining how your life goes. And you're doing that in the context of sex with other people in a collaborative project. But I definitely agree with you that agency is not the only game in town.
And maybe just to quickly,
Yeah.
I also feel like we shouldn't give up, just shouldn't let people take agency away from us, because I feel like I get where you're getting going towards, but like this idea of agency as being, you choose either that or that, and there's a catalogue of choices that you have. But I feel like there's so much good feminist work, and I mean Quill's work among that is just like reclaiming that notion of agency to make it just so much richer and much more socially embedded.
That's
and
what I'm hoping.
this, I think, and I feel like we should hold on to that. So,
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, the reason I think there's values other than agency is because sometimes we decide we really want to do something where we're going to have to give up our agency. Like, for example, if you get on a roller coaster, you cannot get off. Right? You're stuck on it. And then, so in that sense, you've like given up your freedom. There's no exit conditions there. But sometimes we want to do things like that, right? Or I have a much kikier example of like, if somebody wants to be locked into a chastity belt and give their partner the key, and their partner's going to go off to work in another city, they've given up their agency for the day. But like, we can make those choices. We can decide that things are worth giving up some agency. But I agree with Miriam. I think that like for me, it is a rich notion and a social notion, and one that is just so central for me to human flourishing that it's not the only game in town, but it's a really important game for me. Yeah.
Okay. So I liked your rejection of like enthusiastic yes as the base of consent, and you mentioned like a spectrum and sex workers.
Yeah.
And that I think also relates to the question that was asked about, or your comment about like men assumed to be always like one thing and not like excluding the ace spectrum that men and women have, and and there's a man and there's like and the ace spectrum. In order to get into the community, you need to perform or be somehow sexual to be included. And I'm not sure how is your comment about queer communities and its inclusion of like the absence of sex instead of like just the agency or sexual agency.
So is the question about, does the question really have an essence whether I want to include ace people and bisexual people as part of the queer community?
No, I think they're included, but I think there is the unspoken rule that there is also, I'm not sure if we are talking about like hierarchical society and the masculine performance.
Yeah.
And there was also like the assumption that there is some positive sexual contribution.
Yeah, right.
You say.
Yeah. So for men specifically, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I really agree. I think that we have a very strong social assumption that men are sexual and want to have sex. I think that we give men almost no tools for whatsoever for thinking about what kinds of sex they want to have and what kinds of sex they actually don't want to have, right? And like at what point they may just have limits and not want to do things, and that of course goes all the way to ace people who may never want to have sex, and we don't make a lot of room for that at all, right? We don't give men much of a sexual imagination or any freedom to do that. I think that, I mean, I'm wondering whether what you are asking is like what we should do about that, or whether whether I agree. I think that, you know, ace people, I mean, there's a wide range of ace people, and one really good thing that has happened over the last, I don't know, I haven't been counting exactly, but maybe 10 years or so, is that ace people have become much more visible. It really wasn't a concept that was very live until pretty recently for a lot of people, right? And much like with a lot of other kinds of identities and orientations, I think it's wonderful that that is now becoming more visible. And predictably, as with all of these things, as it's becoming more visible, it turns out there's more people that it's a good fit for than we ever knew about, right? There are ace people who just want to have nothing to do with any kind of sexual intimacy, period. But there are a lot of different kinds of ace people, and not only, as you know, you mentioned this, not only do I talk in the book about the fact that a lot of ace people very genuinely want to be sexually generous with a partner and have sex with partners in order to give them pleasure, and that's a completely legitimate thing for them to do. But also, ace people are really visible in a lot of kink scenes and so forth, where they're not necessarily having sex, but they're doing other sex-adjacent activities that are other forms of intimacy or other forms of body play. So there's really a wide spectrum, and you know, if somebody just wants to be not playing any of these games at all and out of it, that's totally fine. But one of the things we need to do is recognize that there are all these different kinds of body intimacy and body play, and there are plenty of ace people who have a place in that space of body intimacy and body play, and we shouldn't be drawing any kind of like hard line between like this counts as sex and so, you know, you're supposed to want it and this doesn't. I don't know where the line is between sex and not sex, but this is part of my larger point in the book that sex is not unique. You know, sex is continuous with a lot of other kinds of joint, intimate, vulnerable bodily things that we do with one another. And I think that for a lot of ace people, there's a real place in that set of activities and conversations, even if in the narrower sense, sex is not a thing that they want. And that's true for men too, and men need to be given resources for finding themselves in that space if that's where they want to be now.
I'm conscious of time, so if we
Yes.
just have one more question in the room, and then there was one more online. But we're not rushing everyone out the door. I'm just conscious people might have places to be. So you can always stick around afterwards and ask your
Okay.
question, get a book signed.
Unfortunately, I saw like multiple hands, but I saw yours first, so I'm gonna ask you to go on.
Thank you. The talk has been really interesting, and from my perspective, I work in sexual violence, and I work with racially marginalized survivors.
Yeah.
So it's a very unique perspective that I come to when it comes to sexual pleasure in particular.
Yeah.
And what I have found myself quite a lot, even beyond just like, was consent given, but actually, do you even know what sexual attraction is? What were you even consenting to?
Right.
Are you even aware of your own, like you said so perfectly, what type of sex did you even want? Did you even
Right.
want sex? Did you even know what the options are out there? Are you even aware of your own gender identity or
Right.
sexuality when it comes to it? So, and I know you mentioned earlier on that the book talks about the people who are like sexually isolated.
Yeah.
How do we reach those? How do we get those communities in place to get them to come to us? Or
Yeah.
even be in the places where they are, especially in today's climate?
Yeah, that's a really hard question, because isolation is one of the hardest things to deal with, because almost by definition, if you're isolated, part of that isolation is you don't know what resources are out there to make you less isolated, right? So, I mean, there's almost a paradox. If somebody is buried in an isolated, toxic relationship, or just has no community resources, part of what they're lacking is the resources to know what resources there are. You know, right? It's really difficult. I mean, the only advice I have, because I think this is a really hard problem, the only thing I can think to say is I think, and you're probably already doing this, but like finding ways to reach people really young is the key, you know? And I don't think it all has to be about sex right from the beginning. So this is kind of why I next want to write a book about parenting, honestly. You know, I think we should be training kids up with tools and skills and agency from a very young age, and it doesn't have to start out being explicitly sexual, right? So for example, I think that toddlers should be taught how to use safe words and when they're allowed to use them, so that they can safe word out of things like birthday parties or foods that they be unsure whether they want to try. You know, they can't safe word out of basic, like, you know, running in front of the street, in front of a car, whatever they do. There's limits. But, you know, when we ask a toddler to do something that is ultimately an optional activity that they may or may not like, they need to be taught how to have agency there, right? We do the opposite right now. We tell kids that they have no bodily agency. We don't even trust them to describe their own experience. We don't give them choices over where they go or what they do or what they eat or what activities they want to do or who they hug, right? Like we're terrible at this. And then all of a sudden they become teenagers and we expect them to understand how to, you know, express their own agency and respect other people's agency, even though we've been teaching them exactly the opposite all along. So I think that by the time people are adults and they're isolated, it's usually because they haven't been given that toolkit all along. So I don't know how, you know, I can't answer the question in exact concrete detail, but finding ways of setting up programs for kids and reaching kids and not billing it as sex education for kids, because there's lots and lots of families that just aren't going to go for that, right? But rather just having a different approach to kids' communities and kids' activities where we try to give them these tools, making more spaces for teenagers to be like out in public space in groups and allowed to have agency and do stuff. And you know, I think that our best hope for ending isolation is to change the way that people got into that situation in the first place. That probably doesn't help you much because you're dealing with people after they're already isolated. So you have a really hard job.
Yeah. Well, I'm also obviously within the population that I work.
Yeah.
It's not like it's an isolation of like it's a toxic relationship.
Right.
It's a community isolation.
Yeah, yeah.
For sure. And it's a community that is unwilling
Right.
to have those discussions or to grapple with that. I mean, I remember talking to my own mother about this. And
Yeah.
her being like, we never talked about any of this.
Right.
It was taboo. You don't talk about this in the community. You don't ask. She was
Yeah.
frightened when she would learn that she had a period. She thought she was going to die.
Yeah, it's so sad. Yeah, it's so sad. Yeah, no, I understand exactly what you're saying. I know we're like really low on time, but let me draw an analogy that I think might be helpful. So, one of my very serious hobbies is that I'm a competitive boxer. And two things about that. Like when you're sparring with somebody, there's a lot of the same issues as with sex, right? You have to be good at negotiating. You have to understand people's limits. You have to be responsive to what they're doing, and you know, understand where you're going to when you're going too far. You have to communicate. So I think that you know, things like combat sports could be interesting analogies with sex, but that's not the reason I brought it up right now. The reason I brought it up is because one of the things I think is cool about the boxing world is that for whatever reason, it's become well entrenched in a lot of different countries, including here and the countries that I spend time in, that kids boxing has become also a place where kids are given a lot of skills and a lot of sort of moral education at socializing and at, you know, a lot of boxing clubs for kids are aimed at some of these more isolated communities. And part of the point is not just to teach them how to box, but to sort of give them the kind of social and moral education that they're not otherwise getting. So I think in general, interestingly, like things like sports clubs, but the problem is like I love that part of the boxing, but then a lot of the values they give them are kind of icky, right? There's like a lot of stuff about like, you know, grit and, you know, if you work hard enough, you'll succeed, and, you know, overvaluing pay. Like there's stuff about it that's kind of icky, but we could do it way better, right? So, you know, kids sports clubs, which are a thing that people feel way less weirded out by letting their kids do, would be an example of a place where we can do that kind of training in better agency. And, you know, that's not the only example, but like just finding spaces where we're not just, you know, shoving down people's throats a bunch of sex stuff, but we're building communities where there's room for teaching people better agency skills and better ways to protect one another's agency from the get-go, I think can help. And then it's easier to have these conversations later, because even if they haven't talked about sex, the things that they're hearing about sex aren't so out of left field. Mm-hmm. But basically, you have a hard job, and I understand that. I don't think there's an easy fix to it. Yeah.
I'm just going to ask this last question because Cora can ask it afterwards. But yeah, okay. Do stick around and ask your questions. Please. So this one said, can I ask about navigating the line between preference and bigotry?
Yeah.
I see people nervous to approach sex with disabled people and dressing that up as liking certain kinds of sex. And that's echoed in some of the ways people talk about sex with trans people. How can not desiring sex with a Black person be immediately understood as racist, but a blanket rejection of disabled or trans sex not be bigotry?
Yeah. I mean, I think a blanket rejection is bigotry. Look, it's a great question. I think it's really important not to fall into either of two traps on either extreme on this. On the one hand, we don't get to just voluntaristically choose our desires. We cannot say, oh, well, it would be politically and ethically better if I were attracted to this kind of person. Therefore, just through a sheer internal act of will, ta-da, I am, right? Or conversely, you know, it would be better, I feel like I'm fetishizing this kind of person and I shouldn't fetishize them, so I'm going to turn that off. We don't have that kind of voluntaristic control over our desires. But oftentimes, people take the fact that we don't have that kind of voluntaristic control to mean that we have no kind of social and moral responsibility whatsoever to work on our desires. And that's not true. So like I said earlier, I don't believe in perfect autonomy. I think our autonomy is never perfect. We can't just make these choices. But there's all kinds of things we can do, first of all, to educate one another about what might be kind of problematic about certain sets of desires. We've already talked about that, like communal education thing. But also, just sort of, you know, you're never going to fully control your desires, but we can try to shape them and play with them in intentional ways, not through just like willing it really hard, but by doing things like, for example, going to art exhibitions that celebrate certain kinds of bodies that are typically stigmatized and that maybe we've internalized some of that stigma. I've been to amazing, beautiful, erotic art exhibitions that have focused on fat people, for example, or that have focused on amputees, or have focused on other kinds of disabled people. Those resources are out there, and we can make the choice to go tap into them. We can be aware that we live in a community or a sub-community where we just don't run into a certain kind of person, right? We can suddenly be like, my God, my community is really white, or, you know, I don't have any trans friends, or whatever it is. And we can make choices to try to change that, to be like, well, actually it's bad that that's the kind of community I'm in. I need to expand my horizons. I need to form intimate bonds with kinds of people that I don't normally do, right? Not in an exploitative way, like, you know, oh, you're trans, let's be best friends now so that I can feel better about myself. But just by like really being reflective about what spaces do we move in, and who are we exposed to, and who are we interacting with. And again, that's not going to necessarily just like reshape our desires in line with whatever vision we have of what they're supposed to be. But the fact is, when you care about people and you see beautiful images of people, you start to find people like that more attractive often, you know? Not always, but like it kind of works, that if you find love and beauty with certain kinds of people, then those kinds of people become on the table for you sexually. So I want to avoid the extreme that says, oh, people should just revise their desires to be ethically and politically good, and also the extreme that says, well, your desires are your desires and you can't help it and there's nothing you can do about it, so you're just stuck with it, and it's not bigotry, it's just the way you're built. Because we have lots of choices about the way we're built, you know? We don't have total control, but there's a lot of ways in which our embodied reactions and our emotional reactions and literally the way we're built shifts if we make different decisions about how we spend our time and what we see and who we talk to and so on. So middle path.
I love that. What a beautiful note to end on. We will have a signing. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, do feel free. If you have a £4 ticket tonight, your ticket comes off the price of the book, and we have a pay it forward system where people have put money behind the till for people who don't have the money. So if you want the book tonight and you can't afford it, somebody's got your back. Otherwise, it's like $10.99 with your book voucher. So do pick up a copy and come to the signing. Which leaves me just to say thank you both so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And will everyone join me in thanking our speakers?